order to become stronger, we have to fall. And when we fall, there's an opportunity to learn. And if we take that opportunity to learn,
like a mouse,
that's when we truly rise. For real, this is how I feel about technology. When companies do the bare minimum advancements, the products become really boring and totally predictable. But when companies take a cold, hard look in the mirror and listen to us, the consumers, that's where we start to see real breakthroughs. My hard drive is squealing at me. Shut up. I'm so sorry about Henry, he's a bad boy. Since I'm a little bit late to the game with this camera, let's just go ahead and get the autofocus section out of the way. And for context, I was a GH4 and GH5 user for years, but ultimately the lack of phase detect autofocus in the Lumix cameras is what led me to try out other companies, and eventually I landed on the Sony a7S III as my daily imaging machine. After running some side-by-side tests between the Lumix S5ii and the a7S III, I'm pretty mind blown to say that this Lumix can actually compete. It's very weird to be using this camera with working autofocus, like good autofocus now. And I'm thinking about my past with Lumix because I was such a fanboy of the GH4 and GH5. And if they would have had this feature of good autofocus, I would still be a Lumix owner, honestly. If I'm being critical and pixel peeping, I would say that the S5ii is probably about 90% as smooth as the a7S III's autofocus. Keep in mind, I was using this native 24mm lens on the Lumix. It's the f1.8 lens, absolutely beautiful. And on my Sony, I was using a third-party Sigma 24-70 f2.8. And I think I was still getting a little bit more smooth results on the Sony. So you could get even smoother results if you had something like a G Master, but we don't mess around with those high-end lenses on this channel. I'm so sorry, they're out of my budget, okay? I also took out the Lumix 50mm f1.8 on this camera and explored downtown Nashville, testing out the autofocus, and it even held up really well in a busy environment like that. Whoa, the autofocus is focusing.
Yeah, no, it works. You don't need to manual focus as much anymore. It's great.
It feels weird to say this, but I would be confident using the autofocus from this Lumix camera in a professional setting, whether it's YouTube stuff like this, if you have a YouTube channel, or even like professional talking head interviews for client videos and whatnot. The one piece of advice I would say is to test your lenses with your camera and dial in the settings that you think look the most natural. That's what I do even on my Sony. I don't just plug and play. I like to make sure to experiment with the settings and get something that looks the most human when it comes to autofocus. This is their very first attempt at phase detect, and it's pretty ballin'. So I think they might have some special stuff cooking up in the Lumix lounge, and I'm here for it. Speaking of smooth, let's talk about the IBIS in this camera. Honestly, it's been a minute since I've shot with a Panasonic camera, and I forgot just how smooth their stabilization can be. If cameras were babies, this one would have the smoothest butt cheeks. There are a couple of things to keep in mind as you use the S5ii's IBIS system. The first one is if you use the IBIS in tandem with the E stabilization setting, you'll get incredibly smooth results, but at the sacrifice of a small crop. If you don't want the crop, just use IBIS without E stabilization. Secondly, with wide lenses on this camera, you can get away with using IBIS most of the time without getting too much warping in the corners of your frame. Once you start using longer focal lengths on this camera, you'll start to see a little bit more jarring IBIS movements in your frame if you're doing any sort of like significant movement with the camera. For example, I was walking around downtown with the 50mm on this camera. I had IBIS on, and it honestly kind of ruined a lot of my shots because the IBIS was trying to overcompensate for the amount of athletic footsteps I was taking downtown. I guess maybe my Nikes were just moving too quick or something, but it couldn't really keep up. And honestly, I wish I just would have turned IBIS off altogether and went with a more gritty handheld look. My advice would be to use IBIS intentionally. It's a tool, so you don't have to use it all the time. You probably shouldn't use it all the time. So just be mindful of the movement you're putting into the camera and decide before your shot whether or not IBIS will help that or hurt that. I found that I get insanely smooth results with the IBIS system in this camera with just subtle handheld movements back and forth or slow walking where I have a lot of control over the camera, it makes this camera look like it's floating. It's so crazy and such a powerful tool, but you just have to be mindful of how you're using it. All right, I got a little juicy tidbit here, so if you made it this far in the video, I love you, and buckle up. This camera is a low light monstrosity. Okay, so we're gonna compare the low light capabilities of this S5 Mark II to my A7S III. So on the A7S III, we're shooting in UHD 4K at 420 10-bit. So this is where the A7S III starts to look a little nasty in these mid-range ISOs. But when you switch over from 10,000 to 12,800, it gets a lot cleaner because it's the second native ISO. And this is where the A7S III really shines in these higher ISOs, which is why it's considered the low light king for video. So now we're gonna test the S5 II, and we're gonna do 6K 420 10-bit internal, and we're gonna start at ISO 640 and just climb that ladder, baby. I still think the A7S III is better once you cross 12,800, but this camera definitely still pulls its weight. I also wanted to run the same test in 4K instead of 6K to see if there were any differences. There aren't any real differences, but I did discover that once you go from 3200 and click over to 4000, there's a dual native ISO there, which is why those mid-range ISOs look really clean and give you more ISO range. It's no A7S III above 12,800, but it's still workable. Okay, so I feel like I may have slightly overhyped the low light performance of this camera. It's definitely good, and at the end of the day, use lights when you can because that'll always get you a better image. This camera does a really good job in that 4,000 to 8,000 range compared to the A7S III. That's where it gets really gross on the A7S III. It's still pretty comparable to the Sony in that 1600 to 3200 range. Honestly, they both look a little bit nasty in that range. So it's nothing like the A7S III after 12,800. This camera, the A7S III, just demolishes it at that point. But in that mid-tier ISO range, it does a good job. So I just wanted to do my best to convey accurate information to you guys. Use lights. Unlike me, I'm just using a window right now. With all these crazy, awesome, optimistic features, it's making me wonder some stuff. And what the stuff I'm wondering is there even a downside? My biggest gripe with the S5 II is the APS-C crop in 4K 60. Panny, I'm not saying I need 4K 120. 60's great. What I am asking for is permission to use the full sensor that you've provided me via US dollars. Other than that 4K 60 crop, my other little gripe is the Panasonic menus. They're still Panasonic menus. They're very busy, crammed full of different settings, and if you're not used to Lumix menus, some of the lingo and the setting names might be confusing to you. My advice for that is just to focus on that custom menu in there. Just add the settings that you use the most to that. It'll make navigating the camera a lot quicker. Utilize your custom buttons too, and you should be good to go. Should be good to go, should be good to go, should be good to go. That's a weird word saying phrase. For a while, it really seemed like Lumix users were gonna be left in the dust in terms of autofocus. For years, the Lumix cameras have been ahead of the game in terms of features and capabilities, as we learned from Philip Bloom in my recent GH1 retro review, link in description. But the autofocus has been a huge factor for a lot of people ignoring this brand of cameras. But I just gotta give it up to the panty fannies out there. Y'all held out for a long time, and now you're just sipping gin and tonics without a care in the world in the Lumix lounge. The S5 Mark II has single-handedly taken the Lumix brand, planted it upon its meaty shoulders, and risen out of the pit of criticism. This camera is just insanely powerful, especially when you consider the $2,000 price tag, brand new. I highly recommend this camera to anybody looking for a reliable, full-frame, hybrid, feature-packed mirrorless camera, especially if you shoot video. But if you do lean more toward the photography side in your work, I would still recommend the Sony a7 IV as a primary camera. It's a really hard camera to beat for photography at that $2,000 price point. Wow, this was a really fun video to make. It felt good to get my hands on a Lumix again. Thank you so much for subscribing. Make sure to text me when you get home so I know you're safe, and watch out for deer. Love y'all. Peace. Bye. Still here. Autofocus? Totally works. I'm out.